So our second research conversation is Shelagh Vainker, Associate Professor of Chinese Art and Curator of Chinese Art in the Ashmolean since 1991. Before that, she was Curator of Chinese ceramics and textiles in the British Museum. She sort of exemplifies the close cooperation of this faculty with the Ashmolean Museum over many years, researching into the material culture of the Northern Song Dynasty and in particular the ceramics industry, about which she's going to be talking now to Jeremy Johns. Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm an archaeologist of Islam in about the same period as the Song, but I know almost nothing about it except for the half-dozen sherds that turn up occasionally in excavations in the Islamic world. So, Sheila, tell us about what you're doing.
Right.
And what the plan is.
Well, the plan is a book on Sung ceramics. Sung ceramics is a major topic in the field of Chinese art history, and there hasn't been a book for at least 10 years. But I suppose the first question is why Sung? And Sung is really the dynasty in China from 960 to 1279, which defines Chinese culture for the subsequent millennium, practically. And Ming and Qing all derives from Sung. Lots of things that one associates automatically with classical Chinese culture, if you like fine porcelain or architecture or even goldfish breeding, can usually be shown to have started actually in the 11th century. And it's defined really because of the success of the Imperial collection. I mean, collecting is something else. Art and antiquity collecting is something else that began in the Sung dynasty. And Sung ceramics were collected throughout the Ming and Qing. And in the early 20th century, when the Imperial collections began to be dispersed, a huge number of very fine ceramics ended up in collections in London, which is, I have to say, has quite a lot to do with how I got interested in them. But they're regarded as extremely fine, and the finest paintings and the finest bronzes and jades are all things that have some association with that period. So it's very much defined by imperial interest. But why should that be the case? I mean, looking at the Sung dynasty, if you start reading any history about it, you realize that it wasn't only a fantastic period for the production of ceramics all over China and to very high technical standards and to the rest of the world in many cases, as Jeremy has mentioned. But if you look at it, it was also a pivotal period if you read the economic historians or historians of agriculture or historians of science, all of whom I found, in general reading, made this point that this was a period after which no significant new development took place. And that's absolutely the case for the ceramics. And in that context, it seemed to me that the taste and the refinement of the emperor was really an inadequate explanation of the quantity of very fine ceramics and other things that we have from this period. And if you think about why those things are in imperial collections, and if you think about why aspects of Chinese culture that are familiar to us through major exhibitions, usually lent from China to the UK and Europe and America. If you look at the Qin dynasty, it's the terracotta army of the first emperor. If you look at the Han dynasty, it's the jade suits of the princely jade suits that were recently in Cambridge. If you look at the British Museum Ming dynasty, it was 5 years of largely imperial stuff. There have been lots of exhibitions about Qianlong emperors, and part of the reason of that is, one, the emperors had the best stuff, but they also had most of the stuff. Because if things weren't deemed fit for their collections or to set a tone for others to collect, then they tend not to survive. So how to explain this fantastic period in the 11th and 12th centuries when so much was happening and so much change was taking place and really significant enduring change? Well, a great way is to look at ceramics. They're an absolute gift because they do not need to be preferred in order to survive, so that you get them in various contexts. And the contexts in which you do get them, all right, there are the ones that have survived in collections above ground. There are also temples, chiefly pagodas. The crypts of pagodas have some extremely fine ceramics in them, which they're different, they're very specific to that religious purpose, but they equate to the sort of things that are preserved in imperial collections. Then there are tombs. It's often said most of China's wealth went underground, and these wonderful objects in precious metals and highly skilled technology are usually found in tombs from very early times. So you get ceramics in Sung tombs, which tell quite a lot. But crucially, you get them in kiln sites, and kiln sites are absolutely all over China. And a point that's been actually made some time ago now is that although we've long admired Sung ceramics in this country, and this is probably a result of Roger Fry and the modernists, as beautiful aesthetic objects, and which then gets equated with individual creation, they're nothing like that at all. They're part of an enormous industry, and they're absolutely mass-produced. And the ceramic industry is actually better equated with the production of coal or iron, for example, than fine individual craft products. And looking at kilns also tells you a lot about the technology and the resources that are used for it. And I'm also actually in this book going to look at the impact that use of resources has on the environment as well. But crucially, they show objects that you don't get anywhere else at all. So what I've put on here is just 3 examples, and actually also one of them's on the printout that Martin circulated, I mean the document there. But I thought I'd just talk very briefly about 3 different types of things that sort of come from these contexts, either because they fill out a lot of information and knowledge that we have from textual sources but don't otherwise have visual material for, or because they actually might provide completely new information. So the first piece here is a box with chess pieces, and it comes from a kiln site in North China, the Yaozhou kiln site, which doesn't get mentioned in all the collector's literature, but was actually incredibly refined and produced really good things. And these chess pieces are one of only a handful of examples that survive. And yet chess was something that was played by the Sung emperors. The last Northern Sung emperor had a pavilion in his palaces which was devoted to chess. People wrote quite a lot about chess. I've noted here 2 Sung texts on chess. These are all about chess strategy, actually. I mean, Liu Junfu and Zhang Xueshi are all about the strategy for Wei Qi, which is actually more like Go. And the one above describes a very fine chess set of the emperor, which clearly doesn't survive. But there are also chess was an enthusiasm amongst the educated. I mean, the Sung is the great period of the meritocracy in bureaucracy and the scholar official. And the scholar officials wrote lots of informal writings that have been preserved as well, because Sung was also the period when printing began and the circulation of texts. But there's a wealth of information in these informal jottings of educated men who talk about all sorts of things, and quite often they do mention chess. Sometimes it's quite amusing. I mean, there was a late 11th century official who said, oh yes, I enjoy chess as a recreation, but then it gets difficult, so I get bored. So there's all that sort of information about stuff. But actually, if you're looking for a chess set, the sandalwood boards, ivory pieces, they're not going to survive. And this is an example of a box with these chess pieces in it, and it's from the kiln site at Yaozhou. And the only other example is actually from the site of the monastery next to the Imperial Northern Sung tombs, which is quite unusual as an occupation site. I mean, excavation in China is mostly tombs and pagodas. Not much is preserved on dwelling sites, for example. So there is an example there, but I think this kind of shows how chess was clearly a thing. We know that from texts, and we don't really know what it looked like. So kiln sites actually can provide you with this. So that's one example. Another one which relates to the piece on the circulated thing is the little bowl has a painting of a peony on it. And it comes from a kiln, which is better described as a kiln complex, because it's in central North China. It's named after one little kiln in a village, well, not a little kiln, but a little village called Suzhou. But actually the type spreads across what present-day 2 provinces and many counties. But it produced wares for everyday use. These things aren't written about or collected at all. I mean, not until the early 20th century, in fact. So there you have a nice picture of a peony on a bowl from an everyday use kiln site, which is actually displaying some very new technology, because this is the first example of overglazed enamels on painted decoration on Chinese ceramic. And of course that becomes a defining thing in the Ming and Qing, the painted porcelain. So that's, in a way, it's a fairly ordinary thing. In terms of its ornament, it is, and peonies appear everywhere. I mean, you see them there aren't that many extant murals, but they very often have peony decoration, and there's a whole range of ceramics that have peonies on. But at the same time, if you look at this list on the handout, those are four writers of the Sung dynasty who've all written these treatises or notes and things on peonies. And the first one, Ouyang Xiu, was a very, very major official who died in 1072 and is in fact the first antiquarian, the first person to really compile collections of inscriptions from bronze rubbings and so on, and to define the importance of ritual bronze vessels in the Shang and Zhou periods. So he's a tremendously prominent figure, and the others too are also well known, and they write about peonies in this quite aesthetic way as well as a quite practical way as well, the sort of weather and the sort of varieties of them. And then finally, if you turn that over, the sort of ultimate kiln site find that you wouldn't find anywhere else is a little group of toys and figures, because who documents childhood? And there are very few texts about that. And this, I think, looking at these kiln sets and these durable objects that survive from them, one has to say reveals information that just isn't preserved elsewhere, which is one of the reasons for looking at them. Thanks.
Thank you. It's absolutely fascinating to let's say a Western archaeologist. You know, I grew up working on the like every archaeologist in Britain, working on Romano-British Britain, and then I went on and worked on the Mediterranean and then moved to the Islamic world. But there, in that context, we study ceramics, not so much for the ceramics themselves, but for what they can tell us about society, about their use on archaeological sites, about trade in the wider national and international society, perhaps a little bit about the actual production techniques as well. But it seems from what you're saying that in China we haven't got that. We've got the kilns, okay, which is wonderful, so we can study the ceramics production from a production point of view. And then we've got the tombs and temples and pagodas, and we've got the imperial collections, but the one thing we don't have are the settlement sites, which would be the only thing really in the West that we'd be interested in. How does ceramics appear in there? How can we date the strata in a settlement site because of the different ceramics and so on? What can we say about relationships between one settlement and another one somewhere else?
Yeah.
This is strange to me. How is it that we haven't got the archaeology of settlement in China in the same way?
I can't explain why that isn't there, but I could explain where that information actually appears in a way, because in a sense you get it from tombs, because lots of tombs are dated, and the tomb occupant, there might be an epitaph identifying the tomb occupant. And one sort of project I did a few years ago was to actually compile a list, I'm sure it wasn't exhaustive, but province by province, of all the dated tombs that had ceramics in them, and then looking at what sort of ceramics they were, and then looking at the what one knew about the occupant of the tomb, which would normally come from the epitaph tablet. And the two things that emerged from that was that the sort of ceramics you found in tombs, I mean, it's kind of understood that tomb goods in the Sung dynasty do actually represent what the deceased used in life. It's a break from the spectacular horses and camels and jade suits and stuff for the afterlife that you get up to that period. So they're everyday things, which is interesting. But they also often come from kilns that were quite far away. So you get a very good identification of the circulation. And that's actually, I mean, that's interesting because anyway, from the technology of ceramics, you can see how information about them travelled. You know, you get the innovative centres in the north, and very soon those types of ceramics are imitated in the south at southern kilns. And you know that things moved around and were exported. But then from these kilns you can see, you know, which types of ceramic ended up furthest from their place of production, which gives sort of fills out the circulation information a bit more. And the other thing that was interesting was that the types of tombs that still had significant ceramics in them mostly seemed to belong to sort of rather medium level or simple, sort of socially, not terribly elite people. And they're very often people who belong to official families who'd probably been slightly somewhat educated themselves, but who hadn't actually held official positions themselves. Or there would be merchants who'd made good. I mean, there had previously been sort of rules that merchants couldn't have particular types of ceramics and everything, but that seems to have been flouted in some of these. So it gives you some information as to who was using what. And I think that's interesting in itself. But one of the nice things for studying this now for me is that when I started it, I was seeing all these things about connections between places and different types of pots and so on. But it was a little bit in a vacuum. So, you know, it's a way of, okay, we know that there were lots of medium-sized market towns and goods circulating. That's sort of known from the economics. But actually, you know, more recently, people have been looking at the writings of officials and their letters, and actually demonstrating how people moved around as well. Because officials were, you know, if you succeed in the imperial examinations, you are unlikely to be working in the capital, and you might come from East China, and you might be sent to an office in the south or the middle. And actually the mechanics of all that is absolutely fascinating. Very often people took a younger relative with them, you know, a nephew or somebody who might be hoping to take the imperial exams. And so we're finding out much more information about that sort of thing as well.
You said, talking about the bowl on the handout, this little one down here, you said that it's the sort of ceramics that are made in vast quantities, but aren't very much appreciated, aren't written about, and consequently haven't been very much studied. Is that right today?
No, they have been studied today. Right. When they haven't been studied was in the Ming and Qing, because nobody took any notice of them. Yeah, because they weren't collected. So
but now they're studied, and they're studied from kiln sites, presumably, mostly?
They do occasionally turn up in tombs, but mostly from kiln sites.
Right. And are these the sort of wares, or are they associated with the wares that are now turning up in huge numbers in wreck sites in Southeast Asia and so on, when they're being exported?
The Suzhou ones, not so much. They tend to be from grander kilns, which had a wide production range.
Right.
So it would be more like the kiln that made the chess set, which produced really fine pieces, but actually had quite a large product range, and was copied at coastal kilns as well. You find production moulds from that site in the north at kiln sites on the south coast, clearly sort of being copied locally for circulating.
There's always a sort of antagonism between archaeologists who work in the field, I'm talking about the West, and art historians who study, let's say, Islamic pottery in museums, because the archaeologists point out, and they're quite right, that the ceramics in museums represent 0.1% of the ceramics that you'd actually find on an excavation, most of which look like bits of dog biscuit, and you'd never dream of putting them in a museum on display. It strikes me that all of these pieces that you're showing us are very sort of high up the techniques of production. Presumably, I don't know how you'd know. I would have thought that most people are just going to have plain unglazed pottery in their houses, but we don't know because
no, I don't think so. No, I don't think that's it. I think one of the astonishing things about it is that what ordinary people had in their houses was exactly this type of thing.
Right.
Possibly without the overglazed enamels, which are rather special, but certainly in that sort of brown and white painted stuff. So and actually, sorry, one more thing about the chess, how these things appear. In these Suzhou kilns, where you get lots of pictorial decoration, mostly in brown and white slip and glazes, there are a lot of pillows. Ceramic pillows are a great thing at that point, and a lot of them have a flat surface with quite interesting painted scenes on. And there's one of dated 1178 or 87 with people playing chess. Right. So another example of how...
I've got a question about the chess set in just a second, but before I get to that, Chris Wickham is very fond of saying, great economic historian of the Middle Ages in the West, he's very fond of saying that half of humankind that there has ever been have been Chinese peasants. So we have to think in terms of most of the population of China have fairly high quality ceramics in their households.
I think they probably did, because if you look at the kiln sites, say, for example, the kiln site that turned into Jingdezhan, which is where the Imperial kiln was set up in the 13th century, and it's still a major site. In the 10th century, that was just starting up, and it was copying wares from the north. But the local material is of such fine quality that it's very good stuff. And it was glazed, presumably anyway, to make it waterproof and more usable. And so what you get is this what's it called, a bluish-white porcelain, and there's a case full of it in the Ashmolean you can look at next to northern samples, which actually leads into what we know as Ming and Qing porcelain, which is simply a matter of refinement and not essentially change, which is where this business of no significant change after the Song comes from. But that was the local stuff, and a lot of this is down to the very high quality of raw materials that you get in China. And one way I've tried to demonstrate that in the Ashmolean, actually, we have this fantastic collection of early greenware, sort of celadons from the sort of 3rd to 6th century. And we're very unusual in having quite a lot of tomb models and tomb figures. And everybody tends to think as tomb figures being cheaper versions or cheaper materials. And in fact, if you look at, because lead glaze is used in the Han and the Tang are cheaper and easier to make than the high-fired wares. But actually, all those little tomb models from that area and that period are made of exactly the same material as the stuff that was used in temples and tea ceremonies and all the rest of it. So it's partly a matter of just having the goods and the skills and technology being used, across the board.
And I mean, there's something very different going on about the economic structure, if that's the case as well. Presumably, you wouldn't expect 12th century peasants to have anything resembling what you're going to find in an aristocratic, let alone a royal household in Europe, or in the Islamic world, really.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I suppose there is the problem is that we can't say for sure what peasants use, but since there's nothing other than this rather high quality stuff,
you don't have dog biscuits at all.
No, I think that I think the nearest you're going to get to a dog biscuit is a site that's really interesting because it was flooded when the Yellow River changed course in the early 12th century. It just landed a whole how many meters thick of silt on a particular village, which was excavated in the 1920s, and this type of ware came on the market, which was named after this site, and is defined by having this sort of reddish silty residue all over it. And that's actually, but all the stuff from that site, and this was a site where there were upturned tables and chopsticks still in bowls found. It's quite high-fired whiteware of this type, and not as fine, thicker, but with a slip and with a glaze, and more roughly modelled, but still, shapes of ewers, quite big, with handles and spouts.
Fascinating. Wow. General questions, please.
Yeah.
Quite a general question about the field. You said things changed around the 11th to the 12th century, and after that there kind of ceased to be big advances in terms of technology and production. Is that right?
Yeah.
Could you explain a bit more, why was that the case? Was that due to kind of a focus on the glories of the past and wanting to move beyond that? Was that due to cultural isolation? What do historians think was the cause there?
As far as the ceramics are concerned, I think it happened because of a political shift. I mean, in the map on the handout, you can see that there are two main cities in the purple area, and Kaifeng was the capital of the northern Song until 1127, and it was invaded by the Jin from the north, and the capital moved to the south to Hangzhou. And the thing is, China's geology has a divide along the middle, along the Yellow River and then turning sharply northwards. And the northern part has one type of clay and the southern part has another type of clay. And in broadly speaking, ceramic technology in the south, the clay body material, a version of it was used for the glaze, whereas in the north, a completely different type. So the whole northern technology is much more complicated. And after the north was lost to the Song dynasty, all those kilns by, within 100 years were pretty ordinary, shall we say. Whereas in the south, the kiln that had started making this bluish-white stuff, which had all the fantastic material, actually came to dominate the whole of the production of the south. And although you get kilns along the coastal provinces and in southern Zhejiang, the Lungchuan kilns particularly, but those two kiln centres were really producing pretty much everything. And so the technology that was used there, the quantities they could produce, really sort of dominated the field. And because by the 14th century, even though the political centre of power was no longer in the south. That was where the industry was, and it just expanded to supply the whole empire. I mean, I think in the Ming and Qing dynasty you do get dog biscuits, actually. This is all very ordinary stuff from around, you know, if it's far away from from the great kiln centre. But I mean, I think in ceramic terms that would account for it. But, yeah.
Got time for one more question. Please.
Sorry, just a question about the context where these objects were found, because you mentioned several of them, like this chess set found on kiln site. Is the reason because they were actually faulty and therefore were just like chucked there by the kiln, or?
That's the usual reason that they stay there, actually, yes. They haven't fired correctly, and so they're left there, and you get waste heaps. And in some kilns, you get enormous, I mean, mounds, very, very big heaps of shards, things that have not been considered. And I mean, the higher quality kiln site, the more sort of grander where it's making, then the more of that you get, actually. And those are fascinating. I mean, for Jingdezhen, for the early 15th century, from the 80s onwards, these shard heaps were investigated, and all sorts of types that nobody had realised were made turned up in different uses of enamels and colours and so on, some variations on things.
Well, were the pieces for this chess set found in the box? Did they throw the whole thing away together?
That I'm not sure, and I think these can't be all the pieces anyway.
No,
so
okay,
I'm not quite sure. I could check the site
some
report, but it shows them separately, I have to say.
Right, some photographic artist has put this together.
I think
Sheila,
so.
thank you very much indeed. That was great fun and fascinating.